Hello, everybody. Hello, all of you. Hello, and thank you so much for coming along today. And I just wanted to start as well by paying my respects to the Indigenous owners, the traditional owners of this land. Let me add my thanks too for their excellent custodianship of this land over so many centuries. And I also wanted to mention that we were very blessed in this same circumstance to interview Ruth Tarvidis last year, and she was so generous with her sharing of her story, along with Aurelio Costarella, who was here. It was a really beautiful time, and that we're all deeply saddened by her loss this week. But we're so grateful that we've now captured a little bit of her so that that can be shared with people in perpetuity. And we're very, very grateful so that's also why we're grateful for you, not that we're planning on losing you, either of you two. But now I'm sitting here with the brains of Britain, so hoping not to say anything too stupid along the way. So let me start with both of you, because both of you had very different experiences of coming to Australia and why you came to Australia, and also the feelings about coming to Australia. Before we get to that little bit, I wanted to ask you both. You're both prominent women in science. There aren't that many of them. What was it that made you both choose science as young women, to be interested in a field that was pretty much male-dominated? Probably still is. What about for you, Di?
I have to say that it was my father who was my inspiration. My father was a zoologist, and then after the Second World War became a teacher, because he felt that teaching young people to be interested in science was the way to go to build up that science. And so he was a zoologist, and I was like a little lamb. I was following him around, and I think it was almost inevitable that I would follow in science.
Yes. Was that unusual amongst your peer group?
Yes, it very much was, and certainly I was also very much brought up in the country. As he got bigger and bigger schools, we began to move into towns and things, but it was very much rural communities I was in. So yes, it was very unusual.
And yet in one sense that might give you a slight advantage, because you would be able to witness real animals doing real things, whereas in the city, of course, they don't. Really? Garlic doesn't come out of a tube?
Yes. I mean, I grew up on the beaches of Devon, scurrying around rock pools, and would disappear for hours with my sister down country lanes on walks, which you can't do today, unfortunately for our children, but or I'd get up early in the morning. I very much remember going into the garden. I mean, I hate the cold, but it must have been cold, seeing the dew on spiders' webs and watching the spiders, and just being very connected to things like the seasons. And so, yes, it's sort of been in my blood for a long time.
Yes, it has. Now, Lyn, should I call you Professor? No, I'll call
you
Lyn.
Just Lyn, please.
Congratulations too on just being inducted into the WA Hall of Fame at SciTech on Thursday.
I know.
In science,
I feel so honoured.
Well, you deserve it.
No,
I mean, it's
I'm not sure I do,
brilliant.
but I'm really thrilled and honoured, and Di was there, which was very special.
Yeah. You've known each other for quite some time, haven't you?
Yes.
It's a long time.
Once I had discovered the museum and become a trustee of the museum, even before that I knew, of course, of the wonderful work that Di does. But ever since I've been one of the museum family, at the moment I'm patron of the Friends of the Museum, and I'm an ambassador. So really, we've been attached at the hip for a long time.
Did you ever share stories of coming to Australia and what that was like for you?
No, we've never done this at all.
Never talked about
it's amazing to hear the difference already. Because I was born in a small city called Gravesend, which doesn't exactly sort of inspire you. I used to walk the dog along the very muddy banks of the Thames. No one in my family had ever been to university. So the difference is, it's interesting to see how we've come together. But I guess my answer to you is, I can't imagine how anyone is not interested in science. You see nature, you see the seasons, you see the stars, you see the moon. You hear about it on the news. I can remember saying to my mum, when there was a news broadcast to say they had discovered the structure of DNA, and I said to her, but it's so small you can't see it under a microscope. How do they know? She said, I don't know. And I didn't know either. But I was interested already. I guess school just allowed you. I went to a grammar school, a state school, but we did biology. We went out on field trips. I went to Darwin's house. I've told that story many times. And I just...
Feel free to tell it again.
Well, just going there, and there was one of the reasons I love museums is that the curator there let me look through Darwin's microscope, and I looked at some of his specimens, and you know, evolution is wonderful, but just all the other things he did on carnivorous plants, love those.
Oh yes,
aquatic plants. Oh gosh, and we're of course carnivorous plants central here in Western Australia with such weak soils. He'd studied, you know, the breeding of dogs. He'd watched how pigeon fanciers had grown all sorts of extraordinary pigeons by selective breeding. He looked at how worms turn over the soil, and for me that was just an inspiration, and that's what I wanted to do. And so I just sort of took it from there. But your other question was, did it occur to me that there weren't many women in science? Well, it frankly didn't. It didn't cross my mind at all. And I knew there'd been some famous women scientists. You know, there'd been the marvellous Marie Curie, who is still the only scientist to win 2 Nobel Prizes. And Rosalind Franklin, who was part of getting the structure of DNA. Sadly, she died before she could receive a Nobel Prize. She very much deserved that too. My teachers were all women. They were scientists in my eyes, so it never crossed my mind that there was any problem about being a woman scientist, and frankly, there never has been for me. I've been incredibly lucky in that regard. But I think that scientists don't mind whether you're male or female, and some of them don't even notice, so there you go.
I'm sure that is true. So what was the effect on your family of becoming the only person who'd gone to university?
Well, I think they were proud. Most of them didn't say it. One uncle wrote me a letter to say, "You're going to be a boffin," and had to look up what a boffin was, because it sounded as if it came from Mars. So I thought, well, that sounds okay. But they were very supportive, yes. It was good. And I was an only child, so it was, you know, I didn't have any siblings to support or compete with. Maybe that was an easier run that way.
Maybe. What about choosing your field of endeavour? Because you're absolutely right. One of the things that I love that you have done in your role as Chief Scientist of WA over all those years was to inspire encouragement and enthusiasm.
Good.
And for people just to go, to be absolutely in awe of science. I mean, that's one of your great gifts.
It is, it's amazing, it's awesome, it really is.
Yeah. But there's such a big field. So for you, how did you choose your discipline?
Okay, at school I did botany because I couldn't do zoology because it wasn't timetable suitable. So I did physics, chemistry and botany. I was lucky enough to crack a spot at Oxford. Our first year course was very diverse. It was with geologists, agricultural scientists, foresters, botanists, zoologists, geologists. So at the end of the first year I could choose, and I chose zoology, frankly, because the teachers were more inspiring and more exciting. We had a Nobel Prize winner there, Nico Tinbergen, who did wonderful work on how animals communicate, and there were lots of other people there who were really distinguished, and I liked the group of students. They were very dynamic too, and it was equal numbers of men and women there, so, and I've kept in touch with quite a few of them, which is really lovely.
And were they all English?
At that point they were, and the two of them actually got married and had a baby during the course, which was almost unheard of in those days, and the staff were entirely supportive all the way through. So that was supporting a woman. I think maybe had it happened a few years before, they'd have said, no, you drop out and become a mum, but they both completed their degrees and they both went off to be scientists.
I find that absolutely
And that was
gobsmacking.
in the mid and late 60s. Yeah, it was brilliant.
Yeah. What about for you? Was it a very English study surrounding environment?
At university, yes, we did have a couple of. We had one person who came from Belgium, which seemed
very
terribly, terribly foreign at the time.
2 hours on the ferry.
And we had one Indian student, but very similar to Lyn, the span of subjects which I did for A-levels, and then at university, and also the same sort of course as well, with very varied in the first year, and then you gradually specialised. And I specialised towards zoology, and then later on into biochemistry and immunology, because I really got tied up with all the sort of biochemical side of it.
Which is not what you're doing now.
I went from working on single cells and trying to punch proteins through cell membranes to whole animals.
And then
whole animals.
Discovering so many species that we didn't know about, particularly around our coasts. I mean, it's interesting to see the evolution, because when I completed my zoology degree, I was going to go off and train to be a paleontologist. I was going to study fossils in London, and then I went to an evening lecture.
Say the British parliamentary system.
It could be, yes. But I went to this evening lecture with my then boyfriend, who turned out complete dead loss and didn't last much longer, but that didn't matter. I'd heard this one lecture, and then I was going to go off and try and work in the area of recovery from brain damage, just inspired by that one lecture. Moved up to Edinburgh, that's where I met my husband, and that's where everything sort of went ding and all worked.
And was it his decision, well, not his decision, but certainly it was his inspiration to come to Australia? Didn't he get a job? He's a doctor, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He was very generous, because by then we stayed in Edinburgh, and I took sort of a bit of a compromise job just to fill in while Richard was doing his sort of fellowships and things, the further training. And then I really didn't know if I wanted to stay in science, but I suddenly realised I did, and I wanted to keep going. And so then it was finding somewhere where we could both work. And that was going to be tough in Britain. By then we had a diddle girl, Annie, now grown up, well and truly. And we thought, if we don't see a bit of the world before she's school age, it's not going to happen. So then we looked for jobs. And we looked at Australia, and Richard said, find a job first, because it's harder for an academic to get a job than it is for a medico. And so I found a job, University of Western Australia offered me a job, and then we thought, well, Richard could locum for a bit, and we looked at the map, and there was this locum job in Esperance, and we went, well, that's only 2 towns away, and then we got the scale bar out and went, oh, it's a big place. But then he was offered a job at by the University of Western Australia at Fremantle Hospital, and then he moved to Royal Perth Hospital. So, yeah, we wanted to come, we thought, to Australia. Richard had worked as a medico in the US, didn't want that system particularly. So that meant probably somewhere English speaking, because if you're a medico, it helps if you can really talk to people. Canada, I had worked, and I liked it, but it didn't feel quite right. So we started by looking in Australia, and that just seemed to work.
Did you have any idea, I mean, clearly not by those two towns, Esperance round the corner, but were you surprised then when you got here about how big it actually is?
Well, staggered about lots of things, the size, but the main thing was the biodiversity. I thought I was coming to a desert. And to come and find that we are a biological hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot, one of the most precious ones on the whole planet. And that was the huge thing for me, because in Britain, at least, if I saw a plant, I would know to which family it was in. Is it in the Rosaceae, is it da-da-da-da-da-da? But here, it was just as if they'd imported it from another planet and just painted them all green, because I didn't know anything. And I thought, I'll buy the flora, and it came in 4 volumes. Very tiny print too, and any botanist here will know that. And that was just, for me, wonderful and extraordinary and special.
Yes. Now, Di, you just spent time in Bermuda and a couple of other places before coming to Australia. What made you come?
Well, my husband and I left England to go around the world for a couple of years and then come back to the UK. So yeah, we lived in Bermuda, and then we had a short time in Washington, DC, and then San Francisco. And we came to Perth because he was a medic and had worked with people from Perth.
And what year was that?
This is in 71. And I must admit, my jaw dropped when we arrived in Perth after sort of San Francisco and places like that. It was, I suppose I thought Perth was the capital of the state of Western Australia, and I expected it to be like a mini London, and it wasn't. And Mike had looked at Oakham, which was at Mandurah, and we'd looked at the map and we'd thought, oh, it sounds great, you know, it's this town, it's on the edge of an inlet, we can go crabbing, we can catch the train up, go to the theatre, come back down, and of course when we actually went down to Mandurah, it was a little bit small. So, but we came here and then decided that we would have children, and we would sort of be here for a year or two and then go back to the UK. But during that time, I must admit, my husband thought it was wonderful, and I must admit I did not take to Western Australia, but then he decided we were staying here, and for me that was really a big shock, because I think emotionally I had not made that decision. I'd assumed that we were going back to the UK. I come from a very close family, and I hadn't made those breaks or those connections at all. So, needless to say, we divorced not long afterwards. But that then meant that I had to stay, because when you've got two small children, yes. you stay. And so I had to then get my head around and make that decision. Well, this is somewhere where I am going to stay, and I'm going to have to make my life. And so I've had a bit of a different sort of relationship with Western Australia.
How did you deal with the fact that you're now a divorcee, you have two small children, your family's in England, and we're talking about in the 70s where phone calls cost a fortune.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I remember the blue aerograms. That's what I remember coming back from.
And trying to phone at Christmas. And
Yes.
And the beep, beep, beep.
Oh,
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
it was very difficult and very isolating. I think you did feel very isolated with no family, but on the other hand, I had and still do have two very close girlfriends, and I guess we bonded, and they ended up in a similar situation to me, and probably had come here in similar ways, and so we just bonded together. We wore each other's clothes, we babysat each other's children. I was the lucky one that I did have, obviously, a background career, so I got the job eventually at the museum, which I must admit was a very pivotal point in my life. My two friends, in fact, had to go back and train and retrain, but you know, I always think out of adversity, you become strong, you become resourceful, you think different ways, and now I'm sort of bipolar, as I said to you, about I'm part of me's English and part of me's Australian. It will always be like that, but I enjoy living in Australia, and I've had wonderful opportunities here for which I will always be thankful.
Yes, I think we could describe you as Austral-English.
Yeah, probably.
Yes. I know that this is personal stuff, but how did you find Australian men in the butch era of the 70s? As a single woman, I know you'd be concentrating on your kids, but you'd also be looking around, I would have thought.
I think being single second time around in Australia for me was very challenging, let's say. It was difficult. I had very different expectations, perhaps, of a male than I should have done. I remember the first time I did actually have a date and being picked up, and we walked out, and I went and stood by the car door, assuming that somebody would open the door for me, by which time the fellow who'd asked me out was round and sitting in and saying, "Come on, get in."
And that was the era, absolutely. It was
a little bit different.
And
yes.
here are you, a little English blossom, an educated English blossom, no less. I would imagine was quite threatening to.
I did find that the job I had at the museum was a part-time job, and I was quite surprised to be told by husbands, friends of mine who were Australian, and the husband several times said to me, well, you're taking a man's job. And I really found that was quite confronting. But equally, I did find that it was assumed quite often with somebody who wanted to get close to me that I would give up my job because I didn't need to work. And, you know, by this stage, there was no way I was going to give up that work. No. And I was enjoying my work. So, yes, there were a few hiccups.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I can remember when our second daughter was born, and I was working at the University of Western Australia, people just assumed at that point that I would stop working. You know, once you've got your family, they thought the right size. In fact, we have another gorgeous daughter after that. But I was surprised to hear that. It wasn't said in an aggressive or a dismissive way. It was just expected. I went, oh no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, I'm staying.
Yeah. Do you think that you would have had that reaction in England?
I can't tell. Just don't have the information.
I don't know either, because I didn't try that in England, obviously. So
no, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because you both had such positive experiences in terms of the educational institutions that you were at, which were so supportive. I wonder if they would have been so supportive here at that time. Don't know. So, tell us then about Lyn. I know professionally you were going, wow, look at all of this flora. This is amazing.
But I wasn't working on it. That was just for fun. That was just, you know, just the surroundings.
And how did you actually feel about Western Australia? Because it was tiny. In 76 you were here?
Yes, came in 76.
Yeah. I mean, Edinburgh, you've just come from Edinburgh, which is crowded.
Right.
Absolutely full.
I found it amazingly welcoming. We came in September, and we actually went down to Albany for Christmas. And the reason we did that was we had 22 invites to spend Christmas dinner with families because we were new and wouldn't have family. And I contrasted that with Edinburgh, where I'd lived when I first went there in a bed and breakfast, miserable as anything. You know, they practically counted the baked beans you had for breakfast. And it took months to get to know anyone. So the first feeling was people being overwhelmingly generous and welcoming, appreciative, keen to make things work for you. We were very lucky. We found a lovely kindy for our daughter straight away. And so we got to know some mums and dads that way. And I think academics, it is easier in many ways because a lot are peripatetic. So you're coming and going around the planet. And so it's much more accepted. So that was the first feeling. The other feeling that I've had throughout is that I suspect if I'd stayed in Britain, in academic life, you're taught to be creative, but you're also taught to be critical. And you have to have that in balance. It's very easy to be more critical, I believe, than you should be, or to be critical in a way that isn't as constructive as it could be. And the Brits were very good at that, the latter. Whereas here, I think you got a lot more flexibility. And the other thing was, if you needed help or support, in terms of intellectual ideas, you know, could you help me with this computer program as they were coming on board, this statistical package, or could I actually start working with a group of animals I never had before and you've got a group there, or could I use this gizmo machine? Everyone always said yes in Western Australia. In Edinburgh, they'd have said, oh no, I was just about to use it. And it would have had dust collecting on it for years. And you knew damn well they weren't ever going to use it again. And that was the difference. So for me, it was a lot more intellectual freedom. So I could work through ideas that quite often, I think if I'd been in Britain, people would have said, oh no, that's never going to work. And then I'd have been too deflated to do it. Here I had the separation, the isolation to develop things for myself and then share it with the scientific world when you showed it worked, but also in this amazingly supportive environment in terms of the people.
Yes. And what for you, Di? Working at the museum at that stage, was that similar?
Oh, very much. I mean, I found it, for me, it opened up a wonderful world. It was science, but also because it's multidimensional there, it's multidisciplinary, so I could sit and talk to all these people from archaeology or history or whatever. So I learnt so much about Western Australia that I didn't know, and I had wonderfully generous mentors there, and one of them's today in the audience, Loisette, and two wonderful women, Loisette Marsh and Shirley Slacksmith, who in the science area took me under their wing and really, really helped me, because I started working, my job was to work on crustaceans, and literally I had done 1 week on crustaceans in the UK, and as I said, I've been working on cells, and I come to work on whole animals, and the curator, Ray George, was another mentor who was wonderful. I had a great research background, but I didn't know the fauna, but through these wonderful people, they have encouraged me and they shared their knowledge with me, and yeah, I have found the same, and outside of the museum as well. I think Lyn has hit it on the head. People are very generous here. They allow you to think outside the square, outside the box, and you can think very in a multidisciplinary way, and you can bring all these things in, and you can actually feel that your brain is actually reacting to that, and I think that's why WA is so inventive. Why you've got so many Nobel laureates and people who come from this area.
And so many migrants.
And migrants,
which,
yes.
Which I think
bring in that
diversity. That adds
diversity.
brilliantly to the mix. So if you go to any group of scientists or any other discipline, you'll find a wonderful mixture, and that makes a huge difference. One of my best students came from Afghanistan. Wonderful young man. And the idea of we can do it, we're going to get on with it, we're not going to cut corners, but we're not going to let it won't work ever sort of interfere with what we really want to do. And I've just noticed wonderful, the Dean of Science from Curtin Uni, Joe, thank you very much, Joe Ward, for coming today. We said we want to get a program going to get all sorts of different microscopes, telescopes, magnifying glasses and the like through schools. We're going to do it, aren't we? Because we make up our mind that we can do it. And it's that wonderful can-do approach, I think, that is so good. And if we don't do it here, it's such a long way before you get to Adelaide where somebody else could help you, so you know you've got to support each other.
But that's true, the most isolated city in Australia. That's true.
And that can work for you. And that's what I think permeates this whole thing of working together. And the fact that I turn up on day one as a trustee of the museum and was just welcomed with open arms and got to know everybody and see all the amazing work it does and right through the state. I mean, that is really special.
I wondered, a few years ago, it seemed to me that there was very much an attitude of scientists working on their own particular research project with a hand, with an arm over like this. We're not going to show anybody in case, I discover the most wonderful thing.
It's the Gollum mine.
That's right. That's right. It's mine. It's precious.
It's precious.
That's right. But it seems to me that just in the last couple of years, there's been a much greater openness worldwide about sharing knowledge, and of course the ease of email must have a great deal to do with that. Has that affected both of your work?
Yes, very much. I mean, it's that communication is much easier now, and it doesn't really matter where in the world people are, because if it's their day when you're asleep, you get up and you've got the emails or the work back from them. And there's certainly, from a funding point of view now as well, I think that's certainly something that's very important, because you can amass a lot more funds together if there's a whole load of institutions and people all working on these big projects. And yes, it very much has affected things.
And I think, there are more people who want to come and collaborate and work with West Australians. We have this amazing biodiversity. We have the least understood of all the oceans just out here that we're looking at right now. We have a unique view of the sky. In other words, we look towards the centre of our galaxy. Only the southern hemisphere does that. So we are experiencing climate change, probably at a rate in southwest of Western Australia, unparalleled elsewhere in the world. So in 2011, the part of the ocean that was abnormally hot compared to the way it should have been, that spot was off Shark Bay here in Western Australia. So scientists want to come and work with us because we have so many skills, we have so many interesting questions that can be addressed for the whole planet, but can be addressed better here, I believe, than anywhere else. I seriously believe this is the best place to be a scientist on the planet.
So
Sorry.
No, please. We're happy about that. But I was thinking, in light of that, how did the last budget affect science? Because it seems to me that the federal government is not putting in enough money into science. Or is the local government even putting enough into science? Is it funded at... I know, Di, you had a wonderful experience Woodside.
Well, I think, you know, one takes opportunities where they exist, and certainly the research work that we've been doing at the museum for a number of years now, we have been working with the mining industry, because one of the things that happens when people have a new lease, whether it's sea or land, they have to do an expression, an EIS, environmental impact statement, which means they have to find out what animals are there and if there's anything that's rare or endangered. Well, quite honestly, there's a lot of new species in Western Australia, and a lot of things. It's a huge area. There aren't that many scientists in the past who've looked at those areas, and so we have, I guess, quite aggressively gone that way to work with those companies. And in fact, at the moment, I have 11 positions funded by industry, science positions in the museum. And that's purely looking at species or new species, identifying species. And we're actually helping the process of approvals. We're helping that speed up for the government. So I guess at different times you have to go for different, you cut your cloth to suit in different ways. And some of those projects, we've one large one we have, has enabled us to, we were talking about multi-national projects, one project with Woodside. We've had scientists from 25 countries involved in that project, which has resulted in something like, I think at the moment we've got 8,000, 9,000 species documented, marine species identified and documented from the northern area of Western Australia. We've got 900 new species and still ticking along and counting.
900 new ones?
New species, yes. And one of the reasons that scientists like to come and work with us is that in WA, you find new species, in England. Where would you find new species?
In the last 2 years, we've discovered 1,500 species of flowering plants new to science. The total flora of Great Britain is 1,482 at the last count. So we're discovering more new ones than the total number there.
Yes.
And I've even got a sponge named after me by the museum. It's in a trench off Rottnest, and it's 230 metres down. So if ever Richard wants me to see it, I know I'm on the way south. But I mean, that is really hugely special. And for me, as a biologist, to have a species named after me is absolutely amazing. To go back to your question, without picking up specifics of state and federal governments right now, but a bit like that table, I see government, industry, academia and the community, and you need all four of those working for science. And quite often you would find, for example, that industry would fund more realistically. It's hard for the government to cover all the costs of a study, and it's long term. So, for example, Woodside have been studying Scott Reef for 21 years. Had a brilliant paper in the journal Science, which is one of the two top science journals in the world, along with Nature, studying its recovery from a cyclone that went through. That is such long-term support. It's very hard for governments to give that long-term support. So I think industry is going to be very key to the future. But the other group I wanted to mention, the community, and I've been very strong on citizen science while I've been chief scientist. And for example, the Alcoa Frog Watch program run through the museum that means we're keeping a very close eye on this species, which are very much sort of sentinel in knowing where climate change is happening and the threats to the environment. And just even out here, we can look at the beautiful Swan Canning now. We were having issues about, do you remember a few years ago, some dolphins were dropping off the cetacean sphere, and I wrote a report on it. And the first thing I said was, we need to know how many there are, where they live, when they're there, what they're doing. There was no way we could have enough scientists to do that. But a brilliant program between Murdoch Uni and Curtin University. We've now trained 724 volunteers who are watching these waters on an almost 24-hour a day basis, putting everything on an app, because we're very modern now, and that's made a big difference. So we know that most of the mothers, when they're suckling their young, will be in the Canning River rather than the Swan River. We need to know things like that for putting exclusion zones in and the like. And we're setting up a junior dolphin watch. Anyone with grandchildren? There are 10 schools and children. There are 10 schools involved already. We want more. And I very much want to see it rolled out for the Peel Harvey and for the Leschenault and for any other waterways in the southwest that have dolphins in them. But this is just a classic example of see government as a key part, but don't see it as the only part. And I think that's what scientists have had to learn increasingly. One, they've got to work in larger teams. They've got to think across the board. If they haven't got a historian, a philosopher, or a social scientist on board in a large program, they're probably missing something. But also that don't look exclusively for government to funding. Look for funding because that's a key part, but also that's to give true recognition of the quality of your research, because it will be peer reviewed like crazy before you get the funds, but it then allows you to work with others. And community groups here in Western Australia are amazing and have done lots of brilliant work.
But it's also the key to any environmental program is to have the people who are going to use that area on board, on side, and more knowledgeable. The more knowledgeable we are about what's happening, the less damage we're going to do. And
not just in biology, so finding the Sydney and the Cormoran, which is another museum program at the moment. We're hoping to photograph both the wrecks completely and build a sort of virtual image that you can walk through them. But that came about not only by sending a ship out there and sending pulses down, but to get to know that it was going to be within a 5-kilometre radius of a certain spot by all the oral histories that were done associating with the museum. So it's putting all these threads together, and that's what makes, and that's why a museum is absolutely central to any society. Yes, we believe that, don't we?
Absolutely.
The fact you're here today supports that.
And I think one thing at the moment with the science that we're interested in is actually talking to local Indigenous communities and finding out what their knowledge is, what they think of our knowledge, the knowledge that we present to them, how, for instance, their 6 seasons fit into our probably 2 seasons really over here, and getting all that aspect going, so that you start to get these different layers of information.
To hear someone like Sean Nannup say, I'm going to start at the Big Cold, and you know that oral history goes back 10,000 years to when, at the end of the last ice age, the Swan River ended at Rottnest, and you could walk to Rottnest. And had that been discussed in the 1600s, for example, by the knowledgeable boffins in the Northern Hemisphere, they'd have dismissed it.
And that whole experience would be entirely different to an experience that you would have had in the UK, because you've had the Anglo-Saxon people there for at least the last 500 years.
Absolutely, totally, yes.
And I mean, I think some of these interesting stories you have of say the rock art in the Burrup Peninsula, and if you look at the rock art, you have pictures of the fauna which is now extinct. You know, animals that are now extinct, and they're also fish. But the interesting thing is that when you actually analyse the time when they were actually painted, the extinct animals were painted first, and then the fish. And when you talk to the local people about the history, they tell you about when the sea was out there, and of course this is when the sea was out there, when then it was all land, and Dampier Archipelago as we know it now, was actually a series of hills. And so they tell in their stories about the animals that are on the petroglyphs that used to catch them. And of course, why the petroglyphs are more contemporary with the fish is because that's when the sea actually came in and drowned the archipelago. And they caught marine, because it's marine fish. And this is the sort of thing that we're getting to what museums can do now, but I think this is where you can start to put all these things together, and where our science is important, but actually layering it with this other knowledge is also very important.
Yes. Why cirripedes? Why barnacles?
Why barnacles?
Really, I mean, I would imagine that most people would look at them and go, not very interesting, and move on.
Yes, well, somebody did say to me once, I'd been studying, when I started working at the museum, I was given a group of crustaceans to study, and barnacles was one of them, and I thought, oh God, no. Worms were also given to me, and I thought, no, not worms. And then there was this crab, and it was a pretty little crab called a fiddler crab, and I thought, oh, that's something I recognise. So I did actually study fiddler crabs for quite a long time in mangroves, and then that work was finished and we did a book on it and this, that and the other, and I had to find another animal. And I chose barnacles because at that time, you know, barnacles are the little things that sit on boats and cause all those problems. But the offshore oil and gas industry was really beginning to start, and I thought, well, that could be a way we could get money by me studying barnacles. You know, they'd want to know what
Darwin
what
was very
are.
interested in barnacles.
Yes,
Oh,
and of
he
course,
loved barnacles.
my hero Charles Darwin absolutely was a barnacle person. So I started working on barnacles, only to find that industry wasn't at all interested in what types of barnacles they were. They just wanted to know how to get rid of them. But I persevered, and again with a wonderful mentor from in the eastern states, and Darwin had come to Australia, but on the Beagle. But he visited Australia at the very end, so he was pretty jaded by that stage. But he did collect barnacles in King George Sound. He did, and I actually have the shivers every time I go.
Do we know where they are now?
We don't know the exact spots.
But are the specimens still around?
No, they're not, but they're described.
Do you know all his histology slides were lost for 50 plus years and then turned up at the College of Surgeons in London? So maybe his barnacles are somewhere.
Well, his barnacle collection is in the British Natural History Museum in London, but unfortunately it was in a series of drawers, and they were sort of stuck down on bits of paper, and they had odd bits stuck with them, and with drawers going in and out, they've all fallen off, and so I've worked with them for many years trying to do that.
Yeah.
But that's the reason for studying barnacles.
Very practical. It's almost your mother hat on at the time, going, how can I make this project work? Because
but they do. It does work. It does work now, because barnacles are economically. They sit on boats, and it stops the boat going quickly. Yeah. So if you're a very large boat, you get and so you use a lot more energy. And so now there is a huge industry into looking how to get them to not stick, but also to get rid of them. And people send me barnacles all the time to say, is this a new one? Is it an invasive one? Invasive species are very important.
Now, just speaking of invasive and multiplying, tell me an interesting fact about barnacles and how they reproduce.
I knew this was coming up. Barnacles are very well known because of all animals, they're reputed to have the largest penis size compared to their body size. But they are hermaphroditic, and so that means they're male and female. But and you can see this yourselves if you go down to the river and you look at the barnacles and the water's coming in, and it's a full moon. They usually are reproducing at that time. You'll see these little white things come out, and they sort of waft around, and then it pops into, and so they are reproducing. You know, they're reproducing with ones next to them.
With their enormous.
With their penises, that's you're actually seeing those going around, which my children used to think was hilarious, and take all their friends to have a look. You know, we're going to see the barnacles.
But even that's a wonderful thing, because their friends then become interested in science and in biology and zoology.
My children, being a museum person, you pick up things or people give you things, and so my freezer was always full of snakes and frogs and this, that and the other. And so every time, one particular, he was a little boy, he's a great big man now, but every time he came round he'd say, "Can I look in the freezer?" Because, yes, so.
Oh, brilliant. Our time is starting to desert us, unfortunately, but I wanted to know, just personally, how do you enjoy Western Australia in a way that perhaps you wouldn't do so if you were based back in Britain? What do you do with your time when you're not...
Me?
Yeah, both of you, when you're not in your various offices?
Well, we go regularly to the WASO. I think the Symphony Orchestra is fantastic. On Friday night we went to Giselle. I don't know how many have been to see Giselle. It's absolutely the most fabulous performance. I can see people nodding in the audience. We go to the Black Swan Theatre. We go to the opera. We can go easily to the museum, the art gallery, the State Library. Although they're theoretically there, if you live in somewhere like London or Edinburgh, you don't go. It's too much of a fag. You can't park anywhere. It's probably booked out with tourists anyway. So I think the culture here is much more accessible. We have amazing parks. Kings Park is the largest metropolitan park in the world. It's bigger than Central Park by 4 hectares. So we've got an ocean on our doorstep. Richard and I were lucky enough, I wouldn't say we were swimming for very long, but we were swimming last Saturday and Sunday, you know, way out of what would be the normal season.
Yes.
Our main house is at Mandurah, actually, on the Peel Inlet, so we really enjoy that, and it's the most beautiful place. So why would you want to visit lots of other places? Yes, but why would you want to live anywhere else?
I agree, but that is a key, though. Don't you find that living here is wonderful, but you often do just need to pop away for short periods.
Oh, yes.
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 It's called shopping. Not just shopping, not just shopping.
No, I've got lots of reasons. No.
Well, I have quite a social life through the museum because we have a lot of openings or a lot of functions in the evening. So I must admit that when I'm not doing that, I'm a bit of a stay-at-home person because I just enjoy being at home. I very much like
You travel
music.
more in your job in a way, don't you? Because you're
Yes.
often away for extended periods on field trips. You go away for a month.
I don't do field trips anymore.
Don't you? Oh.
Unfortunately.
Why?
But
Why?
I don't have the time to do it just with my duties at the moment. But
So send all your team.
oh, my team go and I go.
I bet
"Oh,
you
I'd
miss
like to
going,
go."
don't you?
Yes.
Do you miss going? I bet you do.
I do. But that's okay. That's part of life, you know. I get on with that. But one thing I do like, I like my periods of peace and quiet. So I like my time when I can contemplate in my garden, do some cooking, listen to. I'm very keen on music and I play the piano, so trying to get my fingers back into working. But I also like cooking and I like entertaining.
Yes, I like cooking too.
I have dinner parties and I have certain groups of people where we either celebrate birthdays or we have certain celebrations that we do. So that's...
You don't cook crustacean, though, do you?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
All those years studying.
You have to eat the animals.
I think we're incredibly blessed. I mean, there wasn't a Thai restaurant here in '87, and one opened the next year to much fanfare. They wouldn't even eat outside. There were no cafes outside.
Yes, that's
because,
wonderful
we
too.
possibly had that. We'd all catch dreadful diseases, or
Yes,
something
that's
that
right,
will happen.
yes.
So it's changed dramatically since you
Yes.
two have arrived in the '70s, hasn't it? Perth, the face of Perth, really.
Very, very much. I mean, my impression of Perth in Western Australia in those days was that it was flat and it was rectangular because all the roads were straight. And, you know, after Devon, which is all curvy and things like this, it was just rectangular and it was low. And it was basically Anglo-Saxon, and I think the change, and we were talking before about delis closing at 12 o'clock on a Saturday,
Yes,
and
that's
no
right.
fresh bread and no fresh milk.
And delis weren't even
things.
delis. I mean,
That's right.
they're what we call in the East milk bars. They're not they're not delis as in a delicatessen where you're faced with wonderful rows of hanging prosciutto and beautiful cheeses and breads. It was nothing like that. Was there?
So it really has changed, and for me, it's become colourful, I think.
It's a good word.
Yes.
Yeah. And well,
In all sorts of ways.
yeah. Well, but I think that that's to do with the migrant contribution, really.
Yeah, the migrant and the Indigenous, because the other day, for example, I was opening a conference on recovery from brain damage, and wonderful Dr. Richard Wally spoke before me.
Yes.
And we were joking, we often do double acts. And at the end of his presentation, he said, "I'm handing over to my sister." Now that meant so much to me. That was one of the most wonderful things anyone's ever said to me. So to get to begin to understand a culture, which is probably the longest continuous culture on our planet, how important is that?
It is.
What
it
an
is.
opportunity.
But such a poignant moment for you.
It was very special for me.
Yes. He is a wonderful speaker, there's absolutely no doubt about that, and thank goodness we've all got to the stage where we're starting to open our eyes
Yes.
to it. And that there's not... I remember when the debates about the Woggle were on, and I did it because I was on Talkback Radio, and there would be so many people who would call and say, "Oh, I heard one Aboriginal say this and another Aboriginal say that. They can't even agree." And I went, but why would you think that there was only one tribe? There wasn't, and there aren't.
There's the Eagles and the Dockers. But that is one thing. I think you have to be born into the AFL, I have to say. I think that is something you need exposure at a young age to fully appreciate, and I missed that.
Did you ever take to football or so?
Well, I live in Subiaco, so I've always felt that once they had a football team, I had to support that. But no, actually, I'm more of a soccer fan, and I tragically used to always watch the English Cup final, and we used to have parties where we'd sit with fish and chips and, mushy peas and drink beer and watch. We don't do that anymore, but yes. But Yes, I don't quite get the Aussie rules stuff, but that's fine. I'm learning. Yes.
Yeah. So, in so many ways, you have both embraced Western Australia in so many layers. Is there anything that you miss so much from Britain that is one thing that you would bring here?
The thing I miss, I can't bring, and that's some of the flowers. I'd bring primroses, lilies of the valley, and lilacs. And I know you can grow lilac in the hills, but we can't down here.
No, not down here.
Those are, and yeah, that would be the main thing I'd like.
I agree. I think, I still have very much a spiritual feeling about the landscape and the culture of the UK. And as I said, I think that's inside me and will never change, but it doesn't mean I don't appreciate here at all. But and you can't bring that with you. But yes, I mean, that makes me feel empathetic to Indigenous people, how they feel about the land. And I didn't make that connection for a long time in my head, but I do believe that, where you're born, if you spend a long time, well, I was 26 when I left the UK, so I wasn't two. That had to have an effect on me and my psyche, and as it would with Lyn. And there are things that you miss, but then there are compensations here.
I think that mountain thing, though, is very true. I mean, I miss mountains too, because Perth is flat, very flat, and when you have grown up with mountains, then there is something incredibly, almost viscerally powerful about them, isn't there?
But the one thing I couldn't do is live away from an ocean now, and I didn't live near an ocean before. To me, perhaps you need mountains. I need an ocean, and I have that. The idea of not living so that I could get to an ocean within 5 or 10 minutes, I would find I just couldn't even contemplate that anymore.
Yeah. It's a funny thing, even about travelling in England.
And I'm not a good swimmer or anything. I just have to be close to it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely get that. But the whole thing in England about travelling more than 10 minutes is, my God. You cut lunch, take supplies, do all of that sort of thing. I mean, it's not as bad now as it used to be, but
I don't
here,
know.
Of course, it's perfectly normal to travel an hour or so, isn't it? Quite different. Just one last area. If you were going to give advice to yourself as a young woman, knowing where you are now, what would you say to yourself, do you think?
Who's going
What would I
first?
say? Oh, well, I think I'd say, well, stick to it. I'm glad you stuck to it. You know, stick to your principles and stick to going on, you know, making a life for yourself. Because you will. Believe in yourself. Yeah.
Yes, I'd agree with that completely, and I'd say some practical things. If it was to a girl, not rather than to any young person. Your question was to a girl, wasn't it?
Or to a younger you, I guess.
A younger me.
To the young Lyn.
I would say, as long as you're healthy and those you love are healthy and they love you, nothing's good or bad, it's how you play it. You just have to see opportunities. And I have the great thing in life called the Kepler defense, which was Kepler, who was probably one of the 20 most brilliant people on the planet, mathematician, that's right, isn't it, Joe Ward, and discovered that the planets go in ellipses around the sun. And he twice applied for the professorship at Tübingen University, is turned down. So just the way if they could turn him down, whenever I didn't get a grant or a job, I said, well, what do they know if Kepler couldn't get a job? So in other words, be resilient.
I think your earlier words about being positive and about, I'm paraphrasing, but being kinder than you think. Be kinder.
Always do the right thing. In the end, it's worth it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is. And you'll see people who take shortcuts and it will never be right. If you believe it, just do it and stick to it. But find the best people, and once you've found those, the ones you most trust and can work with.
Absolutely.
It's been fantastic to have you both here, sharing some of your life and sharing some of your experience about coming to Western Australia. As you say, very different experiences, and yet both of you are absolutely pivotal and have a profound influence on us. We're so grateful. So thank you very much. Please put your hands together.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.